Hello guys, welcome to the last chapter of the Empress Dowager Cixi. This is going to be her epilogue, China after Empress Dowager Cixi. Empress Dowager Cixi's legacy was manifold and towering. Most importantly, she brought medieval China into the modern age. Under her leadership, the country began to acquire virtually all the attributes of a modern state. Railways, electricity, telegraph, telephones, Western medicine, a new style army and navy, and many other things. The restrictive millennium-old educational system was discarded and replaced by Western-style schools and universities. The press blossomed, enjoying a freedom that was unprecedented and arguably unsurpassed since. She unlocked the door to political participation. For the first time in China's long history, people were to become citizens. It was Cixi who championed women's liberation in a culture that had for centuries imposed foot binding on its female population, a practice to which she put an end. The fact that her last enterprise before and ultimately death was to introduce the vote testifies to her courage and vision. Above all, her transformation of China was carried out without her engaging in violence and with relatively little upheaval. Her changes were dramatic and yet gradual, seismic and yet astonishingly bloodless. A consensus seeker, always willing to work with people of different views, she led by standing on the right side of history. She was a giant, but not a saint. Being the absolute ruler of one-third of the world's population and the product of medieval China, she was capable of immense ruthlessness. Her military campaigns to regain Xinjiang and to quell armed rebellions were brutal. Her attempts to use the Boxers to fight invaders resulted in large-scale atrocities by this group. For all her faults, she was no despot. Compared to that of her predecessors or successors, Cixi's rule was benign. In some 4 decades of absolute power, her political killings, whether just or unjust, which are recorded in this book, were no more than a few dozen, many of them in response to plots to kill her. She was not cruel by nature. As her life was ending, her thoughts were about how to best prevent civil war and massacres of the Manchu people, whose survival she ensured by sacrificing her dynasty. She also paid a heavy personal price. Cixi was a devout believer in the sanctity of the final resting place, but her own tomb ended up being desecrated. The leaders of the first few Republican administrations, starting with General Yuan, who died in 1916, observed agreed terms of the abdication and protected the Qin mausoleums. In 1927, the more radical nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek, drove these men out and established a new regime. A year later and 20 years after Cixi's death, an unruly army unit broke into Cixi's tomb to plunder the jewels that were known to have been buried with her. Using dynamite, officers and men blasted a breach in the wall and with bayonets and iron bars forced open the lid of her coffin. After seizing the jewels around her, they tore off her clothes and pulled out her teeth in search of any possible hidden treasure. Her corpse was left exposed. When Puji, the last emperor, heard about the sacrilege, he was devastated, as he later described. Now in his 20s, Puji had been summarily expelled from the Forbidden City in 1924. Which had been a breach of the abdication agreement, and had since been living in Tianjin. He sent members of the former royal family to rebury Cixi's remains and protested to the Chiang government. As the robbery became a national scandal, there was an investigation, but it petered out and no one was punished. Thanks, it seems, to handsome bribes all around. When Puji heard a widely believed rumor that the pearl in Cixi's mouth had been plucked out and used to decorate MMA Chiang's shoe, he became filled with bitter hatred. The outrage cemented his resolve to throw in his lot with the Japanese, who made him the emperor of Manchukuo, the puppet state set up in Manchuria, which they occupied in 1931. Japan then invaded China proper in 1937. Cixi had struggled to thwart Japan's attempt to return China into a part of a new East Asian empire, and had murdered her adopted son to prevent it. Ironically, if she had delivered China to Japan, it is almost certain that her last resting place and her remains would have been respected. Chiang Kai-shek, a true heir to Cixi, fought Japan throughout the Second World War. The Japanese devastation of Chiang's state paved the way for Mao to seize power in 1949, although the pivotal role in his rise was played by Stalin, Mao's sponsor and mentor. While post-war Japan metamorphosed into a flourishing democracy, China was plunged into an unprecedented abyss by Mao's 27-year rule, which swallowed the lives of well over 70 million people in peacetime until his death in 1976, put a stop to his atrocities. For his misrule, Mao offered not a word of apology, unlike Cixi, who publicly expressed remorse for the damage she had done, which, though grave, was a fraction of what Mao had inflicted on the nation. Pearl Buck, the Nobel Prize winner for literature who was born in 1892 and grew up in China when Cixi was in power, and who then lived under or observed the subsequent regimes, described in the 1950s how the Chinese whom I knew in my childhood felt about her. Her people loved her, not all her people. For the revolutionary, the impatient hated her heartily, but the peasants and the small town people revered her. When they heard she was dead, villagers felt frightened. "Who will care for us now?" they cried. Pearl Buck concluded, "This perhaps is the final judgment of a ruler." The past 100 years have been most unfair to Cixi, who has been deemed either tyrannical ambitious or hopelessly incompetent, or both. Few of her achievements have been recognized, and when they are, the credit is invariably given to the men serving her. This is largely due to a basic handicap, that she was a woman and could only rule in the name of her sons, so her precise role has been little known. In the absence of clear knowledge, rumors have abounded and lies have been invented and believed. As Pearl Buck observed, those who hated her were simply more articulate than those who loved her. The political forces that have dominated China since soon after her death have also deliberately reviled her and blacked her out her accomplishments, in order to claim that they have saved the country from the mess she left behind. In terms of groundbreaking achievements, political sincerity and personal courage, Empress Dowager Cixi set a standard that has barely been matched. She brought in modernity to replace decrepitude, poverty, savagery and absolute power, and she introduced hitherto untasted humanness, open-mindedness and freedom. And she had a conscience. Looking back over the many horrific decades after Cixi's demise, one cannot but admire this amazing stateswoman, flawed though as she was.